Greetings. This is Caroline Staten with Don Hall, and we're your hosts today. Don, turning it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Caroline. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending this teleseminar on community rights. We, the people, are more powerful than we believe, with Paul Cienfuegos. We appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day to learn from this leader of the community rights movement. My name is Don Hall. I'm with Transition US, and I'll be hosting this call. For those of you who don't know, Transition US is the national hub for the International Transition Towns movement, which is now in 50 countries. And it's about people coming together on the local level to cultivate more sustainable, resilient, just, abundant, and fulfilling local communities right where they live. There are currently 160 plus official transition initiatives here in the U.S. And the job of Transition U.S. is to support the leaders of the Transition Towns movement, to provide them with tools and training, such as we're doing here on this call. And if you want to find out more information about Transition US, you can go to transitionus.org. In order to keep offering programs like this for free, we also ask that you go to our website and make a donation if you can, as little or as much as you're able to. There are one-time and reoccurring options. And we also encourage you to take the information that we're going to learn in this call from Paul and put it to use right in your local community, whether that's with a transition initiative, with community rights, or working with us on the national level at Transition US. I wanted to let you know about a couple upcoming events before I introduce Paul. The big one is our first ever national gathering that is coming up in late July in the Twin Cities. It will kick off on Thursday, July 27th with 6 1- and 2-day intensive trainings. Paul will be offering one of those, and hopefully Paul will talk about that a little bit more during his time with us here. We will be having a number of great evening events. We'll be showing the award-winning documentary film Tomorrow. We have 3 great keynote speakers, Richard Heinberg from Post Carbon Institute, Rob Hopkins, the founder of the International Transition Movement, and Phyllis Young, Standing Rock Elder and Water Protector. In addition to those keynote events, we'll be having 40-plus workshops, bioregional breakouts, and open space sessions. And all of that will be followed by a 2-day leadership retreat and movement strategy session for leaders in the transition movement to come together and strategize about how this movement is going to move forward. So we invite you all to participate in that and to go to transitiongathering.org, our brand new website, to check out all that information there and to purchase tickets. In addition, we also have another teleseminar coming up with another of our intensive leaders, Rebecca Blanco, who I believe is on this call today. She's going to be doing a talk on deep resilience from me to we, an intimate communal exploration on Friday, July 7th from 11 to 12:15 Pacific time, so from 2 to 3:15 Eastern time. So make sure to put that on your calendar as well. Today we are using Maestro Conference as our platform, and currently all participants are muted, but there will be time during the session to participate in some discussion, to answer some questions, to ask some questions. And so at various times you'll be prompted to press different numbers on your keypad, including 1 to raise your hand to ask a question. We'll call on you, unmute you, and then you'll be able to speak. So again, thank you very much for attending this teleseminar on community rights. We the people are more powerful than we believe, by Paul Cienfuegos. And Paul Cienfuegos is a nationally prominent workshop leader and community organizer in the community rights movement, which works to dismantle corporate constitutional so-called rights and assert the people's inherent right to govern themselves and protect their community's health and welfare. Paul has some very provocative ideas about how transition could rapidly expand its impact across the U.S. by teaming up with the community rights movement and its ongoing success in helping more than 200 communities to successfully pass locally enforceable laws that can transition us away from unsustainable energy and resource depletion towards our right as we the people to a sustainable future. Paul recently co-founded Community Rights US to further this work nationally. And you can find more info at communityrights.us and at communityrightspdx.org/podcast. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Paul, and I very much look forward to hearing what you have to say here.
Well, thank you both Caroline and Don so much for setting this up and for inviting me to be one of your webinar speakers. So is it okay to ask how many people are on the workshop besides the 3 of us at this point?
Yeah, there are currently 4 other attendees right now.
Terrific. So what would help me so that I can best focus my webinar presentation, what I'd love is to ask each of the 4 people to just introduce themselves with literally 1 sentence each and just explain in 1 sentence a bit who you are and why this is a priority to be on this call.
We'll start with Albert. Albert, you're now mic'd.
Hello.
Go ahead.
I called in because I'm really very interested in permaculture and fixing our ecosystems and health.
Great, thank you. And next we go to Pat Thompson. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Pat. I'm from St. Paul, Minnesota, and I'm part of the Transition Town All St. Anthony Park group. Have heard a little bit about community rights and think it's a great overlap with what Transition Town does.
Wonderful, thank you. Rebecca Blanco, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Yeah, I've been a little familiar with Paul's work. I think it's been great, and I think it's essential to take the power back from the corporations.
Wonderful, thank you. Nils Paulson, go ahead.
Hi, Nils Paulson. I'm a communications coordinator with Transition US, event organizer here, and formerly a candidate for United States House of Representatives. And yeah, what you just said, Rebecca, spot on. Really, time to take the power back from the corporations and put it back in the hands of the people.
So, Paul, that's who's on the call with us. So back to you.
Well, that's terrific. So thanks very much. So yeah, I've been leading workshops on dismantling corporate rights and returning power to we the people now since 1996 when I founded Democracy Unlimited of Humboldt County, and have been working out of Portland, Oregon since 2011 and also helped to found there the Oregon Community Rights Network. So what I'm going to do is speak for something in the range of 20 to 30 minutes about our work and then open it up to conversation, which Don can help me facilitate with at his control panel, however that works, to encourage others to participate. I think I'd also, since we are such a small group, I'd also like to give Don and everyone else permission that if you have not kind of a changing the focus question, but a clarifying question as I speak for 20 or 30 minutes, if there's a way that you can contact Dawn so that you can ask that question where at the moment that I'm in my presentation, that is also just fine with me if we stick to clarifying questions for my presentation so that you're not left behind not understanding something that I'm saying. And then once I'm done, we'll open it up to a full discussion among our really quite ideally sized group today.
And because I'm running the control panel, Paul,
yes.
Just wanted to let people know that they can press 1 on their keypad, and then I'll mic them. And Dawn, you can see when they're mic'd and call on them. So that's how we'll do it.
Great. Terrific. And so my sound is okay at this point, my audio?
Perfect.
All right. So I want to launch by saying that this movement started in 1993 when a group called the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy was founded, which was a think tank of a dozen people. Some of you may have heard of the work of Richard Grossman, who co-founded it. The acronym is POCLAD. And they were asking a really fundamental and provocative question, which is why is it that we have thousands of activist groups working on all sorts of single-issue campaigns to protect a forest from being clear-cut, to stop a GMO planting in a field, to stop a toxic waste incinerator, to stop our local economy from being turned into a big-box store wasteland, etc. And all of these campaigns appeared to be single-issue, unrelated campaigns. And more often than not, the activists who were in emergency response mode from wherever they were living would be running these campaigns with too little money, too little volunteer time, and more often than not, we would lose those campaigns, and whatever corporate proposal was moving forward would be approved by whichever state or regulatory agency was the approving mechanism for that project. And so on, we would end up with all of these single-issue campaigns that were really quite burnout campaigns where people would lose hope and faith in the system, and enormous numbers of activists would kind of run through this thing and burn out and get exhausted and get depressed and not be involved again. And so they were asking this really fundamental question: how can it be that we've got all of these groups functioning all over the United States, but they don't seem to be succeeding? The trajectories towards more and more consolidated corporate control, elite control, more and more ecological destruction, fewer and fewer rights for working people, etc. And out of that comes two answers, two provocative answers to answer that question. Either it's our fault, in other words, we're not working hard enough, we don't have enough signs at our rallies that the press is going to put on their front page of their newspaper, we didn't get enough signatures on the online petition, etc. That's option one. Or option two, there's something structurally wrong with our activism, that we're not actually understanding that all of these are simply symptoms of allowing the elite in the form of corporate boards of directors to rule us, to make all of these decisions for us. And they were intrigued, of course, with option two, because that was their hunch. And as they developed this way of thinking about what is wrong with our activism, they started to dig in and discover that there are these structures of law in the United States that are hidden in plain sight, that make it really quite impossible, in fact illegal in most cases, for a local community, a municipal government or a county government representing its residents. It's illegal for those local governments to pass a law that prohibits a harmful corporate activity. It's illegal for a local government, to prohibit any more big box stores from being built that devastate the local economy. It's illegal for a county government to prohibit any more clear-cut logging on lands that exist within the county boundaries. It's illegal to prohibit GMO agriculture. It's illegal to prohibit monocrop agriculture. It's illegal to require that food sold in the grocery store, that the grocery stores are required to provide a higher and higher percentage of shelf space to food that's grown or processed or produced within, let's say, 200 miles or 500 miles of the town. So, when we look at, it's illegal to tell a private utility company's board of directors that they can no longer support fossil fuel-focused energy production and distribution, that we want a different kind of renewable energy system. And the reason it's illegal because of these structures of law that are hidden in plain sight. So what normally happens in conventional activism is that you try to stop these challenging and harmful corporate activities. Most of the time you lose the fight. And you don't ask, the community's activists don't ask this really fundamental question, why? Why is it so hard for us to stop harmful corporate activities? And in fact, why is our opposition deemed illegal in many cases? And so as this group, POCLAD, was delving into this history, they discovered these three structures of law that I say are hidden in plain sight that make it literally impossible or illegal for local communities to create a truly sustainable and resilient reality at the local level, and then ultimately scaling up to the state and federal and global level. And very, very briefly, in a nutshell, these three structures of law are, number one, something called state preemption. And I'm guessing from who's on the call that you've probably already heard of and know something about this. In this specific context, what state preemption does is that any time the state government is already regulating a corporate activity through its regulatory agencies, so logging is regulated by logging companies, agriculture is regulated, energy production is regulated, land use policy around big box stores is regulated. So anytime the state regulates a particular kind of corporate activity, i.e. it legalizes and normalizes that kind of activity, it is illegal for the local or county government to prohibit that corporate activity. That's state preemption. And it's really common for progressives to assume that this is something that Republican state legislatures do. But in fact, both parties do this all the time at the state level. In my city of Portland, currently, we're having a housing emergency around the prices of rent going sky high. We want basic rent control laws in place through our city council, tenants' rights protections, and our state prohibits the Portland City Council for passing any of those kinds of laws because of state preemption. So that's the first one. The second one is something called Dillon's Rule, Dillon''S. Dillon's Rule is named after a guy who is a late 1800s Iowa State Supreme Court judge who came up with an idea that the proper relationship between state government and local government is that of parent and child, that the state has all the authority and the local has none. That he said that the local government is a mere tenant of the state government, like a landlord-tenant relationship. And so we end up with a system of law because of Dillon's Rule, which gets instituted nationally in the early 20th century, where the local government is literally only allowed to pass laws in categories that are granted to it by the state government. And anything outside of that violates Dillon's Rule. So state preemption and Dillon's Rule, in a sense, are two sides of the same coin. State preemption is, again, if the state regulates that corporate activity, the local cannot ban it. And Dillon's Rule is the local government can only pass laws that it's allowed to pass as pre-approved by the state government in categories that are approvable by the state. So local government ends up with virtually no authority to protect the health and welfare of its citizens and of nature at the local level. The third structure of law is corporate constitutional rights. Most people these days have heard of the phrase corporate personhood, mostly because of this pretty infamous Supreme Court decision 5 or 6 years ago called Citizens United, that further expanded the rights of corporations to exercise their First Amendment free speech rights to pretty much manipulate our elections in any way they want to through unlimited piles of money. But that's actually just, Citizens United is just one of the latest in a series of Supreme Court granted constitutional rights that they've been granting since 1819. That's 1819. which is 198 years ago. So for 198 years, the U.S. Supreme Court has been granting to business corporations free speech rights, property rights, rights to a jury trial, rights to protect them against search and seizure, property rights, I might have already just said that, recently the right of religious freedom, and on and on. And so corporate lawyers have turned these constitutional rights into an incredible bulwark against citizen authority as we the people in our so-called democratic republic. So we end up with corporations, because they're so economically powerful, able to use these corporate rights to really squash the basic rights and protections that we think that we have and deserve as citizens in this so-called democratic republic. So those are the three structures of law that I say are hidden in plain sight. So in terms of what is a proper response to that, in 1999, the community rights movement is born, and it's born in a small, rural, conservative farm community, Wells Township, Pennsylvania, where farmers have been battling for a couple of years to try to stop a giant hog factory farm from moving into their township, which would pretty much destroy the quality of life and the property values and the air quality and the water quality in this rural farming community. And they're battling this factory farm application in the way that they've been taught is the proper mode, which is pleading with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. But as they discovered, regulatory agencies such as the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture automatically approve the applications for corporate proposed activities as long as they are what's called administratively complete. As long as the side studies are filed, as long as the signatures are in place, unless there's some outrageous reason not to, what you end up with consistently is that state and federal regulatory agencies around energy, food, waste, healthcare, communications, they approve these corporate activities because they're administratively complete. And so the farmers were really distraught and amazed by this, because as good conservative patriotic citizens, they thought that we, the sovereign people, have the right to design and define what happens in our communities. So they were shocked, and they went to this public interest law firm and asked this law firm that had been working with them for a couple of years already through the regulatory process, why can't we say no as a local community to something that our residents overwhelmingly don't want? And the answer was a shock. It's because it's illegal for local governments to do that because of these structures of law. And they asked these attorneys, could you help us to draft a law that would ban factory farms in our township? And the public interest attorney said, we could do that. We could draft that kind of law, but you have to understand it would be illegal. It would be a violation of existing law because it would violate corporations' constitutional rights, and it would violate state preemption and Dillon's rule structures of law. Well, the farmers at this point were so distraught about the destruction of their township that people had lived in for many, many generations that they decided that they got to a point culturally. So this is a township of just a little bit over 500 people. And they reached a point where they were less afraid of a lawsuit from the company or from the state than they were afraid of losing their quality of life that they really cherished. And so they passed overwhelmingly, in fact unanimously, their township supervisors then passed an ordinance that this law firm had helped them to write that banned factory farms in Wells Township. It was passed unanimously. Within a few years, 20 other communities in rural conservative Pennsylvania had stopped factory farm applications in those communities through the same process. Communities in Maine started hearing about this movement in rural Pennsylvania. They were battling Nestle Corporation trying to stop water bottling plants. And a few communities in Maine contacted this public interest law firm, and they ended up passing successfully community rights ordinances that banned corporate water bottling from their communities. And the movement grew and grew, and about 6 years ago, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the first and only major city in the United States to have passed one of these ordinances. As was mentioned earlier by Dawn, 200 communities in 8 states have now passed these really legally groundbreaking ordinances or local laws. Pittsburgh is the only major city to have done so far. They were under the gun because applications for fracking sites were being filed with the city, all over the city. And they ended up passing a much more comprehensive and I think more kind of conceptually elegant ordinance for the first time that instead of just being a corporate ban was designed as a community bill of rights. They decided that they wanted to enact into enforceable local law in Pittsburgh the right to water, and then prohibit any corporate activity that violated their newly established right to water. So they banned fracking under something called the Right to Water and Self-Government Ordinance. And that has become the model since they passed it half a dozen years ago of the rest of the ordinances that have followed in the last 6 years, where rural communities, townships, villages, counties, and Pittsburgh, major city, have now passed ordinances that enshrine the right to water, the right to a local food system, the right to be free from aerially sprayed pesticides, the right to a sustainable energy future, the right to sustainable infrastructure, and I'm probably forgetting a few others right now. So each of them designs and defines a new Bill of Rights that the community is going to self-enforce at the local level, and then prohibits any corporate activities which would violate that newly established Bill of Rights, Community Bill of Rights. And so that's the movement as such, and I've been doing this in a nutshell. I do workshops all over the United States that are a full weekend long, and you've just heard something like 3 or 4 hours of presentation in 10 minutes or 15 minutes. The last thing that I want to share with you is just a little bit more about how this movement is developing. I live in Portland, Oregon, and helped to establish the Oregon Community Rights Network a couple of years ago. There are about a half a dozen counties, just to give you an example, in my state that now have active community rights organizations. We've had a number of losses at the ballot box over the last few years, and just a couple of weeks ago, Lincoln County on the Oregon coast was our first successful win by a total of 61 votes yes, more than the no votes. It was a squeaker. Lincoln County a few weeks ago banned any corporations aerially spraying of pesticides. There's an ongoing crisis that's been going on there for decades, that after corporations clear-cut forests, they then spray herbicides and pesticides from the air, from helicopters usually. And there's cancer clusters happening all over the county. The water's being poisoned. Fish are dying in the creeks, on and on. And the company, of course, claims no responsibility. So this is the first win that's happened in Oregon in what is about 6 years of my and many others' active participation building a network at the state level. And one of the reasons that you would build a state community rights network that's made up of your local community rights groups is that these structures of law are embedded into state and federal law. So it's not enough to then pass these really exciting, groundbreaking bans on harmful corporate activity at the local level when chances are there's a reasonable chance at least that a corporation or the state will come down and challenge you legally in a court saying you can't do this because it violates one of these 3 structures of law that I've mentioned. That's not sustainable in the long run to constantly be passing local laws that violate existing laws. And so many states, about 6 of them and climbing, have established state community rights networks to take this work to the next level and to open it up to working to challenge existing structures of law that are embedded in our state constitutions or in our state other state legal structures. So, for example, in Colorado, their community rights network over the last year and the next few years is working to collect sufficient signatures to pass a state constitutional amendment in Colorado that would, for the first time, ban corporations from having the right to sue local governments that are simply trying to protect their own health and welfare by prohibiting harmful corporate activities. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I'm hoping that that makes sense. So that for the first time, the local right of community self-government is enshrined into state law, and the state and corporations can no longer interfere with one specific provision, which people always ask me about, which is, can't you use this kind of challenge of state law to take people's rights away? Couldn't you use it to ban abortions countywide or put gay people back into the closet, for example? And our argument is that the local government should have the legal right and authority to pass a protective law that raises the floor of rights and environmental protections, just in the same way that the state governments already have the right to create stronger environmental protections or a higher minimum wage than the federal government now sets. That's an understood, non-controversial right of state governments. We're arguing that exactly that same principle should exist between state and local, that the local government should have the right and authority to pass laws that raise, not lower, protections of rights for people and environmental protection. So that it's always, as you go, if you scale down from federal to local, each layer of that scale should have the authority to raise the minimum, to raise the floor, but not to lower it, consistent with existing laws. So I've thrown a lot at you already, and maybe I should stop there and see where people's comments and questions are.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Paul, for opening up the territory of the community rights movement here. And I want to see if people have any questions or comments on any specific aspects of that. All you need to do is tap 1 on your keypad to raise your hand, and we'll call on you and unmute you. I think first is Nils Paulson.
This is fascinating. I'm actually really just appreciating listening to you, hearing examples of localities that have passed ordinances that have essentially been.
Nils, I need to tell you that you're in and out of being understandable.
Oh,
I don't know if there's
okay.
a problem.
No, maybe I'll have to try and raise my hand if someone has a question.
Are other people also having a problem with Nils' audio?
Yeah. It was going in and out. So, Nils, just raise your hand again, tap 1 on your keypad when you have the audio problem corrected. And right now we'll hear from Albert and then Pat. I believe that you're live, Albert.
Hello. I just wanted to say that I'm still paying attention, and I don't have any questions.
Well, thank you for that. We'll pass it on to Pat and then Rebecca.
Hey. So this has really been really enlightening about the kind of the levels and particularly the 3 legal underpinnings of this. So in the long term of you can try and pass, state laws or whatever, and they may or may not, or local laws, as you said. But, what would be the ultimate idea? Does it take like a constitutional amendment? Does it to change these three underlying? What would be the kind of the long-term goal in order to make it much easier to do this on a local or state level?
Yeah, it's an important question. Thank you. The state preemption and Dillon's rule could be attacked at the state level by changing state laws. The corporate constitutional rights is embedded federally. So yes, what I didn't mention is that once a sufficient number of state community rights networks have been established, they work together to form a federal community rights network, and that group starts to envision amendments to the U.S. Constitution, just as the lower scale envisions amendments to the state constitution. The federal community rights network has already been established as well, has been meeting for about a year. So clearly this is a long-term strategy, but when we look at how major social change has happened over the years, the decades and the centuries in the United States, what I think is always consistent is that you start by building real political power at the local level, and then you push that power up into higher and higher scales of governance. And so for us, it's really important that we pass laws that challenge these illegitimate laws, these laws that are violating our rights as citizens, that we pass them first at the local level, and then we push up to the state, and then we push up to the federal as we build power as we the people. The other thing that I wanted to say is that surprisingly, of the 200 communities in 8 states that have passed these laws since 1999, only about 5% of the communities have ever been legally challenged. That's been a shock to all of us. And I think that as we become more successful and more people hear about us, that percentage is going to go up. But basically what that means is that so far, approximately 190 of 200 communities have successfully stopped fracking or water withdrawal for bottling or factory farms or pipelines, etc., in their communities or counties, which is really quite striking when you compare that ratio to conventional activism, where we tend to lose. And even when we win in those rare situations where a regulatory agency decides, because there's so much public opposition, to turn something down, that one win in a particular case doesn't support any of our other campaigns, any of the other single-issue campaigns, because we're all so disconnected. But a single win within the community rights framework builds this new legal structure for everybody across the United States. So, just to give you a really brief example of this, a judge at a county, I think it's a county or a state court, I can't remember, in Pennsylvania, find the exact quote here. I don't actually have the right thing in front of me. I thought I did, but never mind on that example.
Am I still on?
Yep, you're still on, Pat.
Okay. So just out of interest here, I'm actually from an area of central New York, about probably 50 miles from Wells Township, so right along the border kind of, and not far from Dryden, New York, which I don't know if they use this as part of their anti-fracking, successful anti-fracking effort or not. But that then later led to the New York moratorium on fracking. So anyway, maybe you could just talk about how you see this overlapping with Transition Town.
Yeah, if I'm remembering correctly, Dryden was the centerpiece of the campaign to get the governor to ban fracking statewide. Right. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. And so just very briefly on that, so that's not a community rights focused strategy in the sense that the state, when Governor Cuomo banned fracking statewide, that ban is only as good as Cuomo is the governor.
Right.
The next governor could say, well, we're no longer going to ban fracking, and that's the end of that. And so what we would argue is that what still needs to happen in New York, and I'm not saying it's not a very significant win that this already happened, but what ultimately needs to happen is the law in New York needs to change at the state level to enshrine the inherent right of local communities and counties to govern themselves around these environmental protections. And that hasn't happened in New York. So you're still at the whim of whoever happens to be in elected office at the state. And I've lost the second part of what you said.
I was just wondering if you could talk about how you see this working with Transition Town. And I can guess, but I think it'd be cool to hear your.
Yeah, well, so what excites me most about the community rights movement that I've been part of for a couple decades now is that a movement like Transition Town, a specific town or county could come together through democratic process and say, well, we want to place into law, for example, a very rapid transition in locally enforceable transition towards 100% renewable energy, let's say, in our community. And you could do that through the passage of a community rights ordinance, a right to a sustainable energy future ordinance. Or you could pick water protection, or you could pick a local food supply, and that you want to push the culture faster than people voting with their dollars is ever going to be able to push the culture, and have a majority of people through the ballot box or have your local elected officials supporting a law that pushes retail grocery stores or pushes farmers to be shifting towards a new kind of definition of sustainable, and over a particular enforceable timeline that starts to prohibit a higher and higher percentage of unsustainable activities, be they around energy or food or water or whatever. I mean, it's a governance. The community rights framework is a governance framework where literally anything that you can get a majority of elected officials locally or of the public, if you have the ballot box capacity in your state, it becomes law, and then the people can enforce it directly. Does that answer the question, or am I still not quite getting your question?
No, that was, yeah. Okay, cool. We should maybe move on to the other person who had the question.
Just one last quick thing. It's really difficult for people, even visionary groups like Transition Town groups, to imagine that we have the authority to do this, right? We are so colonized as citizens at this point in the United States that we assume that we're powerless. So the change that has to happen mostly happens inside our heads, that we have to convince ourselves that we, the people at a local community level, have real decision-making authority. But the reality is we do. And that guarantee of the right of self-government is built into our constitutional framework. It's written into the first few sentences of every state constitution.
Great. Let's go next to Rebecca, and then we'll go back to Nils.
Okay, Paul, do you, and you may have sort of answered this a minute ago, do you have the wins meant that the state laws have been overturned, and along those lines, when there's a win in a community, is a trail blazed for efforts like this in the community moving forward?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question, but
if there's an effort to create a community ordinance on any issue, well, let's say on farming, and it passes, and it's successful. Another effort coming forth in the future after that, would that effort be easier?
Absolutely, it would, because
of the community. Go ahead. Because
what would be happening in the process of building public support for your first ordinance campaign is the culture shift that happens simultaneously, where people start to feel more and more excited and hopeful that there actually really is something that the public can do at the local level to protect their future community. So there's a culture shift, there's a paradigm shift that takes place in people. The conversation shifts. around, you mean really we can actually do something? Oh, okay, I want to be involved. And so yes, it becomes easier and easier to get a second and a third ordinance written because people are starting to understand that they actually have authority to do this. But that was only one of your questions, I think.
The other question I had was, well, actually there were two questions in one, but I did have another question, and I realize you do a 2-day workshop on this, but so just could you at least briefly walk us through what would be the initial stages of developing a community rights ordinance?
What normally happens is that I would come into a community or one of the other people from our organization, Community Rights US, and we would lead, normally it's an introductory evening workshop, like a 3-hour introduction to community rights, history, and strategy. That's usually what's required for 10 or 20 attendees at that to be convinced to attend a full weekend training, which would happen a few weeks or a few months later. You would come out of the full weekend training with all of the tools you need to form a functional community rights group and to start collectively envisioning what your ordinance would say. At this point, because the movement is so advanced, there's a kind of a template that any local group can use to build out from, so that the form is already established for what a community rights law would look like. From there, if you were to use the various resource network people that we have in Community Rights US, we would have network people supporting you in how to make decisions as democratically as possible and dealing with conflict resolution and the basic organizing skills that are necessary to do that. We would be able to offer you legal support, although what we find more and more is that communities that are doing this assume that it's all done by lawyers when in fact about 80% of it can be done by lay people who are just starting to understand, what their rights are in terms of like what do we want rather than what do we think we can get. And so we would provide you with a series of resources all the way along. And in some communities where there's already an established critical issue that a lot of people are freaking out about, the community's trying to, the timeline from first workshop to putting an ordinance in front of the community or in front of your local elected officials could be as little as 6 months. If you're trying to build that culture shift around an issue that people aren't even thinking about as urgent, but would really help the community to become more sustainable, it might take you a year or two to do the public education work so that there's substantial support.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Great. So we'll go back to Nils, and then we have Albert.
Hey, I hope you all can hear me a little better, can you?
So far,
so good.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks, Paul, for the great presentation so far. Two questions came up for me. One was during some of the case studies you mentioned, like the hog farmers in the township in Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh. I'm curious about what happened after they created these ordinances and laws. Have they been successful in implementing them? Have they been sued? Have they been overturned? So that's one bit. And then the other is I feel the call to do local empowerment work through all of this, and I'm wondering, what would you like to see happen at a federal level? I mean, what would you, if we had a fantasy Congress in there, are we just talking about overturning Citizens United? Is there more that you'd like to see come from Congress as well? Those are my questions.
Let me tackle the second one first because it's a quicker answer. Overturning Citizens United would do almost nothing to actually get corporations out of our elections, because all Citizens United accomplished for corporations was to give them even more First Amendment free speech rights in the form of money to manipulate election results. They'd still be able to give an enormous amount of money, but it wouldn't be, the sources of that money would not be secret. That's about the main thing that would change. So what we really need to do is tackle all corporate constitutional rights and their First Amendment constitutional rights that people have been told by our media all come from Citizens United actually originated from a different Supreme Court decision in 1976 called Buckley versus Valeo, V-A-L-E-O. You can look it up on Wikipedia, and you can learn about it. Buckley versus Valeo. So really, we need a bunch of constitutional amendments that would end corporations having access to constitutional rights at all, and going back to a system of law. And this is the piece of the workshop that I have no time to delve into in such a short amount of time. That after the American Revolution, corporations were established by state legislatures uniquely one at a time, with privileges granted to them in their charters, not rights. And so we actually have this pretty impressive history that we can refer back to and say that's actually the system we need to bring back, rather than making it up from scratch. In terms of your first question, it's very interesting what happened with Wells Township and the other 20 communities in rural conservative Pennsylvania. The corporate lawyers never attacked any of these ordinances initially. What they did was they worked behind the scenes with the state attorney general and the state legislature and demanded that laws be passed that would ban local communities from banning corporate agriculture. The state attorney general and the state legislature, which tended to be, and this is true in most states, Democrat or Republican, which tend to side with corporate agriculture over local agriculture, which most state governments don't take very seriously, truly local farm issues. The state legislature assumed that it could very quickly pass this ban on locals banning corporate agriculture. As it turned out, there were so many rural communities of patriotic conservative citizens in Pennsylvania that were outraged that their right as the sovereign people would be violated by such a state law, that the state legislature battled dozens of these communities for a full 6 years before the state finally got it passed, this local ban, at which point some of the local townships that had passed the corporate ag bans amended their local ordinances to say that if the state dared to begin to enforce the ordinances, the ban, that the local townships would initiate secession from the state, that they would literally leave the state. That's how adamant they were that we the people have constitutional authority over government and not the other way around. And so there's been a stalemate ever since where the law is in effect, but it isn't being enforced. And 20 communities now have successfully stopped corporate factory farms.
Wow. All right.
It's pretty fast.
Anything else, Nils, or going to go on to Albert next? Albert, are you there?
Yeah, hello.
Yeah.
I have a kind of left field question that I was kind of pondering. I'd like to know what your take on the contract that a birth certificate is, and if maybe we could empower ourselves over the level of corporation as an entity.
If you're talking about the citizen sovereignty movement around state citizenship, I'm thinking that might be what you're talking about. That's a completely different strategy.
I don't actually know that.
Go ahead.
I don't actually know that, and I'd like to write it down. Could you tell me again?
Well, I know that there's a completely separate social movement in the United States that I don't know that much about. I've heard lots of claims which seem kind of wild to me that I've never seen sourced as defined and provable, that say that there's certain things that individuals can do to get themselves out from under the federal government. And I can't really tell you anything about it other than
I was told that
movement.
The birth certificate is a contract, and that it's a contract stating that we are partial owners in the corporation that is America, as established in around the 30s, I believe.
Yeah, I'm really sorry, but I can't tell you anything about it other than that I've never been able to track down anything to prove those claims. Yeah.
I was just trying to think of a fast-track way to take away the power that the corporations have.
Yeah, it's not part of what we do. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been a great discussion. We're going to hear some closing comments from Paul in a minute. I did have a couple questions myself that I wanted to throw out there. One is about maybe going the other direction from what you've been talking about with community rights, which is a big issue here in Sarasota, Florida, where we have a lot of gated communities, which is kind of an oxymoron. There are a lot of people in there who want to grow home gardens, but their homeowners association does not permit it. And I'm wondering if the community rights movement has run into that issue at all, and how does that fit in with your philosophy? I mean, in one way, it's even more local government. You're on the neighborhood or community level, but on the other hand, they're passing these, restricted ordinances that don't allow people to start growing their own food.
I'm guessing that they're not ordinances at the municipal level; they're more covenants that the private entity has created. Does that sound right?
Mm-hmm. Could be. I'm not sure about the exact nomenclature, but
ordinance, yeah. Technical term for a municipal government's law, mm-hmm. or a county government's law. So unless you're talking about the legal boundaries of a city or county jurisdiction, which you're not at this point, that's not exactly an ordinance. The problem with these protective covenants is that when you move into such a community, you basically subordinated yourself legally underneath a corporation which owns and manages and makes decisions about that covenant. So my guess is you become, I don't know this for sure, but my guess is you become a shareholder of a corporation in a kind of condominium kind of setup, but I'm not really sure. So there isn't really any way that a community rights framework could be used unless you're talking about the whole town or city or county.
Okay. My other question relates to an effort that I was involved with here in Sarasota to remunicipalize our electric utility, to in effect buy it back from our electric service provider, which I don't know how much you know about energy in Florida, but we have a very powerful public service commission at the state level that oversees all utilities, and basically all utilities have a monopoly in certain areas. And we were working here at the city level to buy back the infrastructure and to have electricity provided as a public service where local people could have more influence over, say, if we wanted more renewable energy included into the mix. And we just narrowly lost the vote 3-2 for remunicipalizing our electric utility, but we did get some concessions, and one of them was a renewable energy fund where some of the proceeds from this monopoly agreement would go into a fund that would then pay for renewable energy systems. We did about a year of work on this, and it wasn't what we wanted, but it was still a significant achievement. And the next commission came in and rolled the whole thing back. They eliminated the renewable energy fund, And a lot of us were left pretty frustrated that we had put so much time and effort into this, only to have a new commission come and undo our work. I'm wondering what your thoughts about that kind of situation with politics on the local level is.
You could definitely use the community rights framework for what you're describing. The commission is the state commission. Did I understand that correctly?
The city commission.
So a city commission overruled the utility board?
No, they overruled when a couple new commissioners got elected, and there was somewhat of a different political climate. They went back on what they had promised to the community just a couple years previously.
I don't recall right now whether Florida is a state where you have legal access to the ballot box to do direct democracy at the city or county level. Do you know?
I think that we can put amendments on a ballot. I know on the state level. I don't know on the local level.
It's a much longer conversation that I have with you often, but if you are a home rule chartered city or county, that gives you more authority to do various things to take your power back. It also sounds like it's time to unelect some of the people who are ignoring the public will. I work a lot in rural Midwest communities. I go there every 2 or 3 months to lead workshops in Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, small towns. And those are towns with no state ballot initiative at all or local ballot initiative access. And so they're literally at the first phase of doing this kind of organizing. They're having to throw people out of local elected office, kind of a good old boys network that's been ignoring the people's will for decades. And they are successfully doing that all over those 3 states and the communities that I'm helping to organize. So, if one of the things that happens in the full weekend workshop that I lead is you come out of there with a completely fresh understanding that if the city or county's elected officials are ignoring the people's will, then it's the absolute duty and responsibility of the people, of the voters in that community, to toss them out and to put people in place who will respect the right of local community self-government. That's really the root of this entire movement. And people have actually successfully done that. Whole communities have gone from not paying very much attention to who gets elected to a litmus test around local community self-government and then electing the right people. So that may be the first phase that you'd have to do, but I'd have to find out much more about the details.
Yeah, sure. All right, well, that's very helpful. And I see that Rebecca has her hand up, and I think we have time for one more quick question before we close.
Oh, thank you. Paul, are you open for a philosophical question?
Please.
So outside of the legalities of this, why do you think, or what do you think are some of the factors that have contributed to this unfolding process by which people have become increasingly colonized by the corporations, outside of the infrastructures?
What do you mean outside of the infrastructure?
Yeah, outside of the. In other words, if you can share your thoughts about that, outside of what the legal structures are about, what would this country was built on such a strong foundation regarding democracy. Yet it appears to me like your movement which is so exciting. It's coming out of the fact that we have thwarted our democratic principles to such an extent that we need movements like the ones that you're doing. And I'm wondering, given that you're into this such a big way, if you could share your opinion as to why we've given up such power over 100, maybe even 150 years. Another
really outstanding question. Thanks, Rebecca. it's a long answer, so I'm trying to think about, and we spend literally 3 or 4 hours in the weekend workshop on just the thing that you've raised. Trying to do this in just 2 or 3 minutes. We actually come from a framework in the community rights movement that we're not coming out of. Let me start again. We believe that the United States has never been a functioning democratic republic. We don't come from a conventional position that corporations have seized the levers of power, which is where more single-issue activism comes from as an assumption. We believe that the United States was designed to look like a democratic republic but not function as one, right from the beginning. And if you look at, for example, James Madison, who was the primary drafter of the Constitution that we're now operating under, he said in the Federalist Papers, the primary purpose of government is to protect the opulent minority from the majority. That's an exact quote. So if you actually dig into the deeper belief systems of our founders, what you discover is that there was absolutely a revolutionary impulse during and after the American Revolution to create real democracy at the local level, kind of a decentralized democracy. And within 10 or 15 years of the American Revolution's success, we started to see the consolidation of elite rule from above. Is a much longer conversation. And that, in a nutshell, the first century can be defined as the 1% in the form of slaveholders and other elite property owners. You have to remember that in our first century, we the people was literally defined as white men with property. So we had minority rule for most of the first century, that most of us didn't have personhood. We didn't have access to the Constitution. The second century of the United States is mostly white propertied men hiding behind the corporate veil, pushing corporate constitutional rights starting in the late 1800s to the present so that they maintain minority rule. So we have a different historical analysis than you usually hear. And when people listen to this analysis, in more than just a 2 or 3 minute version, they tend to come out of a weekend thinking, wow, the mess that we're in now makes a lot more sense structurally. That we've been assuming that we're just trying to get our country back, let's say since the 1960s or 70s from the rise of corporate power, but that the problem is actually much older than that. That there are structural problems with us right from the beginning. Just as one example, if you read the U.S. Constitution, it's mostly about property and commerce. It's not about rights at all. That the amendments are where the rights are, and they were added years later as demanded by the states because they were so upset with the Constitution. So there's a lot to unpack here that I have no time to unpack.
Yeah. Well, that was very enlightening, just that abbreviated version of it. Thank you.
You bet.
Great. Well, any closing comments here, Paul, as we're wrapping up and nearing our time?
Yeah, I wanted to just close by kind of giving you, reading you a couple of sentences from a couple of state constitutions to kind of give you a sense that this stuff isn't just some wild, crazy social movement's claim, that we really have rights that are guaranteed here historically. So, for example, in my state constitution in Oregon, the very first paragraph, natural rights inherent in people, we declare that all power is inherent in the people and all free governments are founded on their authority. And the people have at all times a right to alter, reform, or abolish the government in such manner as they may think proper. I'll read one more to you. Here's Iowa. All political power is inherent in the people. This is in the first section again. Government is instituted for the protection, security, and benefit of the people, and they have the right at all times to alter or reform the same whenever the public good may require it. And one last one. Here's North Carolina. All political power is vested in and derived from the people. All government of right originates from the people, is founded upon their will only, and is instituted solely for the good of the whole. So I just want to remind people in the workshop that this is our history, that government is required to serve us. It has duties and responsibilities to us, and that when it isn't doing our job, we the people have the rightful power and authority to exercise our self-governing authority and take our country back. So, and that's really the basis of our movement.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much, Paul, for what was promised to be and was a very provocative presentation. And I think that, normally in the transition movement, we kind of think of ourselves as not doing political work, but this kind of organizing around community rights definitely feels like it could be a powerful tool for community awakening, which is what we're all about with transition. And I just want to remind everybody that Paul will be doing a one-day intensive at our first ever national gathering in the Twin Cities in late July. So do please check that out at transitiongathering.org. And Rebecca Blanco, who is on the call today, will be doing our next teleseminar on Friday, July 7th from 11 a.m. to 12:15 p.m. Pacific, and you can find more information about that on the Transition US website, transitionus.org.